On May 20th, 1916, at the Stromness whaling station on South Georgia Island, the station captain was sitting quietly, finishing his meal. Suddenly, the door burst open. A man ran in, breathless and shouting, urging the captain to come outside immediately. He insisted that what he was about to see would be impossible to believe. The captain stepped outside and froze. Standing before him were three men. They were painfully thin, their faces hidden beneath long, untrimmed beards. Their clothes were torn, their bodies filthy, and they looked like men who had not bathed in years. They barely looked human. The captain asked who they were. The man standing in the middle spoke calmly and said his name, Ernest Shackleton. For nearly 10 seconds, the captain said nothing. He simply stared. The last time he had heard that name was in November 1914, almost 2 years earlier. Shackleton had arrived at this very place with a crew of 28 men, announcing his plan to do something no human had ever done before, cross Antarctica on foot. Months passed. No news ever came. The world assumed they were dead. And now, 2 years later, Ernest Shackleton was standing there alive. The captain finally spoke and asked the question that mattered most. What happened to the rest of your crew? Shackleton looked at him and replied, "The story I'm about to tell. You may not believe it. It was a story of survival in temperatures below -40 degrees Celsius. A story of human endurance pushed beyond its limits. And a story of nature treating men like fragile toys." Shackleton had named his mission the Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The plan was simple but terrifying. One team would enter Antarctica through the Weddell Sea and attempt to walk across the entire continent. Another team would wait on the opposite side, near the Ross Sea. Shackleton believed the journey would take about 3 months. For this mission, he chose a ship called Endurance, a vessel built to survive violent storms, crushing ice, and the harshest seas on Earth. He selected his crew with extreme care. Experienced sailors, skilled mechanics, and trained doctors. But above all else, Shackleton wanted men who would stand by him under any pressure. In August 1914, the expedition left England. It was a tense time. The world was preparing for war. By October, they reached South Georgia Island, the final outpost before Antarctica. Local whalers warned Shackleton. The ice that season was unusually dangerous, but his decision was final. On December 5, 1914, Endurance sailed from South Georgia toward the Weddell Sea. As they pushed deeper into the ocean, the environment began to change. The water slowly thickened into ice. The wind grew stronger. By January, progress became painfully slow. Traveling even 1 kilometer felt like winning a battle. Then, without warning, the ship stopped completely trapped in the frozen sea. At first, no one panicked. They were prepared for situations like this. The crew grabbed tools and climbed onto the ice, hacking and cutting, cheering whenever the ship moved even a few inches. But Shackleton watched in silence. He knew small victories meant nothing. Nature had not been defeated. The ship would move slightly, then freeze again. Morale began to fall. The sun never set. Antarctic summer had no night. They worked under the sun and slept under the same sun, hoping the ice would eventually melt. February arrived, and with it, the realization that the ship was no longer just stuck. It was imprisoned. The ice grew thicker. The massive ice sheets beneath their feet were constantly shifting. These floating slabs were the same kind that once sank the Titanic. But this ice did not strike suddenly, it crushed slowly. As the ice moved, Endurance was twisted and squeezed. The hull bent. The ship sank deeper with every shift. And worse, the frozen sea carried them farther and farther away from their goal, drifting deeper into the Weddell Sea. Shackleton saw it all happening. But he refused to let fear break his crew. He created strict daily routines. The men played with the dogs, kicked a football across the ice, and worked tirelessly to clear the frozen sea around the ship. Still, Shackleton knew the truth. The dream was over. Crossing Antarctica was now impossible. By March, temperatures dropped to between -20 and -30 degrees Celsius. Endurance had become a frozen tomb. Food supplies began to shrink. The crew hunted penguins and seals just to survive, hoping spring might free them. They prepared sledges, repaired lifeboats, and organized supplies. They were no longer chasing a dream. They were preparing for a fight against Antarctica itself. Then, April arrived. The ice began to move violently. Cracks thundered across the frozen sea like cannon fire, and trapped in the middle was Endurance. On April 14th, a massive wave slammed into the ship. Wooden planks shattered. Steel bolts ripped free like bullets. Icy water flooded inside. The ship was finally breaking. Shackleton immediately ordered the crew to abandon the ship. By May, the sun had completely disappeared. Antarctica had entered total darkness. The crew set up tents directly on the ice and named the place Ocean Camp. Their lifeboats were kept close by. The cold was so extreme that the men were forced to sleep pressed tightly against one another just to stay alive. A photographer had been traveling with them. He captured haunting images of the trapped ship, photographs that would later become historic proof of what they endured. As the months passed, October arrived. These men were no longer explorers. They were survivors. For 9 months, Endurance had been trapped in ice. During that time, the frozen sea had carried them nearly 2,000 kilometers in the wrong direction. Finally, on November 21st, the ship gave up its final fight. Endurance broke apart completely. Only fragments remained on the ice. The rest of the ship disappeared beneath the ocean. The crew managed to save food, water, tools, navigation equipment, and records. Morale collapsed. Everything they had worked for was gone. But in that moment of darkness, Ernest Shackleton stood before his men and became their anchor. He announced that the expedition was over and that their new mission was simple. They were going home. There was no radio, no telephone, no way to call for help. They were stranded on a floating sheet of ice, drifting wherever the ocean decided to take them. The crew did not give up because Shackleton did not give up. The ice around them was still frozen solid, making it impossible to use the lifeboats. So they remained on the ice, waiting for it to break apart. Only then could they attempt escape. A full year had passed since they became trapped. The outside world had no idea whether they were alive or dead. In conditions like these, rescue was impossible. They now had just 3 lifeboats, 1 sled for hauling supplies, a few personal belongings, and food that would last barely a month. Shackleton calculated their position. The nearest land was Paulet Island. If they could reach it, they might find supplies left behind by earlier expeditions, enough to survive a little longer. He ordered every man to carry no more than 2 pounds of personal items. All remaining strength would be used to drag the sleds and lifeboats. The expedition photographer had nearly 400 photographs. Because of the weight limit, he was forced to keep only 150. Those images would later become some of the most powerful survival photographs ever taken. Weeks passed. Food shortages worsened. The puppies that had traveled with them did not survive. Each lifeboat weighed nearly 1,000 kilograms. Dragging them across ice was brutal, and now summer had arrived. The surface ice softened, making movement even harder. After traveling a few more kilometers, they faced thin ice and open water ahead. They were trapped again. They could not move forward. They could not go back. Once more, they pitched their tents on the floating ice. Each man received a single biscuit, a small amount of cocoa powder, and a little canned meat per day. To survive, they hunted seals and penguins daily. Shackleton often lied to his crew about how much food remained because he knew morale was their greatest weapon. Without hope, they would not survive. Then, on March 30th, disaster struck. The ice beneath their camp cracked violently. Tents collapsed. Men ran in every direction as the ground shook beneath their feet. Some fell into freezing water and emerged shaking uncontrollably. They began moving their bodies rapidly to avoid freezing to death. Miraculously, no one died. But the message was clear. Death could come at any moment. They were now fully trapped on a drifting ice sheet with no control over where it would take them. All they could do was pray for land. Shackleton calculated their position again. He realized they were near Joinville Island. Paulet Island, their original hope, was now behind them. This was terrible news. Joinville Island marked the edge of the Antarctic Peninsula. Reaching it almost guaranteed death. They now had only two possible destinations, Clarence Island to the north or Elephant Island. Beyond that lay thousands of kilometers of open ocean, the infamous Drake Passage. Even today, sailors fear it. Waves there can reach 12 meters high, and an estimated 20,000 sailors have lost their lives in those waters. Shackleton knew one thing for certain. If they continued drifting on this ice into that ocean, no one would survive. Food supplies were nearly gone. The last spoiled meat was fed to the dogs. To collect drinking water, they packed snow into metal containers and tucked them inside their jackets, letting body heat melt the ice. Every day was a fight against cold, hunger, and despair, and the worst was yet to come. Even then, water was scarce. They could only manage a few sips each day. By sheer luck, the crew came across some sea lions. From them, they were able to gather nearly 100 pounds of meat. Some men had also made the painful decision to sacrifice their own dogs to conserve food for the group. On April 7, 1916, while drifting on the ice, Clarence Island appeared in the distance about 80 kilometers to the north. But then, strong winds from the east began pushing their ice floe away from the island. The ice sheet itself was shrinking, becoming increasingly unsafe to stay on. Shackleton immediately ordered the crew to board the lifeboats and attempt to reach their destination by water. But the journey was far from smooth. Icebergs and thick ice blocked their path. After hours of struggle, they finally reached a new ice floe and set up camp. Then disaster struck. The ice cracked violently, splitting the sheet in two. Shackleton found himself on one side. The rest of the crew was on the other. From a distance, he watched as his men drifted away, but courage prevailed. Using the lifeboats, they managed to reunite with him. The wind continued to shift, and the ice floe rocked unpredictably. At first, they aimed for Clarence Island. Then they considered Joinville Island. Ultimately, Elephant Island appeared to be their best chance. The island offered the highest likelihood of eventual rescue. The floe drifted north, and temperatures rose from -20 degrees Celsius to -8 degrees Celsius. Open water began to appear. Elephant Island lay about 160 kilometers away. Within days, the ice sheet that had been their fragile home floated to a point roughly 50 kilometers from the island. Shackleton gave the order. All lifeboats were to be launched. On April 15, 1916, after nearly a year and a half adrift, the crew finally set foot on solid ground. They had reached Elephant Island. But relief was short-lived. The island was barren, no birds, no vegetation, no signs of life. Beyond it lay the treacherous Drake Passage, where the chances of encountering a ship were almost non-existent. Shackleton now faced a new challenge. They could no longer rely on floating ice. From this point onward, survival depended entirely on themselves. To be rescued, Shackleton and his crew needed to reach South Georgia Island, roughly 1,300 kilometers away. Traveling such a distance in small lifeboats with 28 men was nearly impossible. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton assembled a team of 6 men and set off for South Georgia in a small boat. He promised the men left behind that he would return with a larger ship to rescue them. The journey was grueling. The tiny boat had to be rowed by hand. They devised a schedule: 4 hours rowing, 4 hours resting over and over each day, navigating through icy, open seas. Winter had returned to Antarctica. The sun barely rose above the horizon for a few hours each day. In the tiny boat, the men had packed food, but there was barely space to eat properly. They had to lie down just to manage a meal. Struggling against waves and exhaustion, they finally neared South Georgia Island. They were now just 3 days from their destination. Then, a massive wave struck, nearly capsizing their boat. The vessel rocked violently for hours, tossing them around. It felt as if they might be trapped among the waves forever. But slowly, steadily, they made progress. And finally, on May 10, 1916, they reached South Georgia. But reaching land was only the beginning of their challenges. The island spanned roughly 100 square kilometers, and they had landed far from human settlement. To reach it, they had two options: travel 200 kilometers around the island by boat or cross roughly 40 kilometers over land. The problem? South Georgia was dominated by massive, uncharted mountains. No one had ever crossed them before, and Shackleton had none of the gear usually required for such a climb. Yet, he had no choice. He took 3 companions and began the ascent. Inch by inch, they climbed over icy slopes. The first peaks led only to deep valleys below. Undeterred, they climbed 3 more mountains, never giving up. Finally, on the 4th mountain, they saw it, the human settlement, Stromness Whaling Station. 2 years earlier, Shackleton and his crew had met these people. Now, on May 20th, 1916, they returned worn, bearded, and sun-darkened by the harsh Antarctic elements. The captain at the station was astonished. Everyone assumed Shackleton and his men had perished in Antarctica. But here they were, alive. The captain immediately offered clothing and food. Shackleton wasted no time. First, he rescued the 3 men who had waited on the far side of South Georgia. Then, he sent urgent messages to the world requesting help to rescue the 22 crew members still stranded on Elephant Island. The Chilean government provided a large, ice-capable ship. Shackleton himself commanded the vessel. Misfortune struck 3 times. Each attempt became trapped in ice, forcing him to return. Yet he refused to give up. Finally, on August 30th, 1916, Shackleton reached Elephant Island. He could scarcely believe his eyes. The crew had survived, turning overturned boats into makeshift shelters. In Shackleton's absence, Frank Wild had assumed command. The men hunted penguins and seals for food, maintaining morale under brutal conditions. Each morning, Wild encouraged his men, telling them Shackleton would soon arrive. The long nightmare was finally coming to an end. The courage, determination, and leadership of Shackleton and his crew ensured that all 28 men survived one of the most extreme survival stories in human history. This concludes the cinematic retelling of Ernest Shackleton and his 28-man crew, a story of perseverance, bravery, and human endurance in the face of impossible odds. There are many more videos like this on our channel. You can watch those videos. If you like the video, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel.